introduce this bill. Thank you.
I call the honourable member Holly Walker. Tēnā koe, Ms Walker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou te whare. Mr Speaker, the Green Party is pleased to support modernisation of our local electoral law and to support greater transparency about candidate donations in local body elections. Clearly, there are unfortunate gaps in our existing legislation which have allowed candidates to exploit the so-called anonymous donation provision. And thanks to the Honourable John Banks, we all know about this and are finally doing something about it. Mr Speaker, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about John Banks in my contribution this evening, largely because as a single member of an irrelevant party, I think it's really not a great use of this House's time. And we've heard at length from our Labour colleagues about what gave rise to this bill and why it became apparent to the government that we needed to update and reform our local electoral laws. And after this bill passes, I think we will agree that we'll have a significant improvement to those local electoral rules and processes. After it passes, anyone who works with a candidate and knows the identity of someone who makes a donation of over $1,500 must declare the identity of that donor to the candidate. That is a good change, Mr Speaker, and it's one that the Green Party supports, and for that reason the Green Party will continue to support this bill. However, the bill, unfortunately, is a missed opportunity to even more closely align the rules for local body elections with those governing general elections and the ones that govern ourselves as parliamentary candidates. And both the Minister and our Labour colleagues have identified that one of the aims of this legislation is to bring the provisions governing local body elections more closely into line with those governing general elections. We agree, Mr Speaker, in the Green Party, but unfortunately this bill actually doesn't go very far towards doing that, apart from the change it makes to the rules around anonymous donations. It's been designed to clear up what was identified as the mess that John Banks left, but it actually hasn't taken much of a wider view on what else needs tidying up in our local electoral law. Mr Speaker, the Green Party also has a members' bill in the name of my colleague Denise Roach here that would do exactly that, that would actually align the provisions governing local body elections much more closely than this bill does with the provisions governing general elections. That would include a $5,000 cap on donations by any person or group to a candidate. It would include a lower $500 limit on anonymous donations. It would include a ban on overseas donations. It would include penalties, which is very important in the context of, I think, the example we've heard, penalties for avoiding rules relating to donations. Very importantly, it would include regulation of third-party spending in local body election campaigns, and I'll return to that in a moment, and it would include a pecuniary interest register for members of local authorities. And Mr Speaker, in an era where unfortunately we're seeing a trend towards greater council amalgamations, and certainly in the era of the Auckland Super City, as the John Banks example has demonstrated, campaigning for local election is a big deal and it deserves the same level of scrutiny and public transparency as that for a general election. There is a lot at stake for someone campaigning for the Auckland Mayoralty, Mr Speaker, and the public has a right to the same level of transparency about the conduct of those candidates for the Auckland Mayoralty as they do for us as parliamentary candidates. So, Mr Speaker, when the time comes, we intend to move amendments in the committee stage to implement some of these more substantive changes, which would achieve the effect that the Minister himself identified of actually more closely aligning the provisions for local body elections with those of general elections. However, Mr Speaker, if there's one area that the House, if it turned its mind to in the committee stage, could pull out of what I've just outlined, and adopt, it would be the regulation of third-party spending in local body campaigns, as it seems clear that this is a major gap in this bill. Mr Speaker, this bill doesn't change any of the rules relating to how third parties can engage and campaign in local body elections. And just to outline the problem with the current provisions, which this bill doesn't change, current provisions, for example, would allow for unlimited spending by third parties who campaign against certain candidates. It would give, in that situation, no obligations for those third parties to disclose what they had spent, impose no cap on what they could spend, and basically require them to meet no regulation at all. And I believe that a campaign of this nature, Mr. Speaker, and we heard about this at the Select Committee, is actually planned in 2013 in Hamilton. An individual with the means to do this, who doesn't like any of the incumbent candidates, has declared his intention to campaign against the re-election of any of the incumbent councillors in Hamilton. And there is absolutely nothing, Mr. Speaker, in the current provisions around third-party spending in local body elections to prevent that person from doing that, or to place any restriction on how much money they can spend doing that, or to place any disclosure requirements on that person of what they do. And that seems a clear problem, Mr. Speaker, in the context of provisions that do impose spending caps in local body elections. Similarly, if third parties chose to make donations to a campaign ticket, which increasingly is a common thing in local body elections for candidates to stand under a common ticket, if a third party decided to make a donation to that ticket but not to the individual candidates on that ticket, that again would be subject to no additional scrutiny, no requirement to disclose the donation, no cap on the spending. And that could be spent on general advertising for the ticket, effectively promoting those candidates, but as long as it wasn't assigned to one of them in particular, it would not be captured by the provisions in this bill. That seems clearly unfair, Mr. Speaker, and clearly against the spirit of having campaign spending caps in local body elections. It's my view, and the view of the Green Party, Mr. Speaker, that this issue should have been given greater attention in this bill. But I was pleased to see that it was recognised by the committee in its report, which noted that the regulation of third-party spending is, and I quote, absolutely necessary to prevent inequities in the future. And I want to congratulate my fellow members of the Select Committee on this item. And I'm really pleased to see it recognised. It's just a shame that we couldn't get that provision into this bill in time for it to come back at the second reading. I was encouraged, however, to hear the chair of the committee, Scott Simpson, in his contribution earlier, express the hope that the government might consider regulating the spending of third parties through an SOP in the committee stages, and I hope very much that we will see that in this House. Mr. Speaker, another area of concern to us in this bill is the new powers given to the Minister of Local Government to adjourn local body elections in the case of a natural disaster or similar disruption. Now, currently the electoral officer is allowed to adjourn the close of voting by up to 14 days, and certainly in light of the experience in Christchurch with the devastating earthquake, we can see that there is a rationale for granting some greater flexibility to suspend for longer and to suspend other parts of the election as well as just the close of voting, the nomination day, for example. But we don't see why it should be the Minister of Local Government, through order in council, who has this discretion to do that, particularly given the current government's enthusiasm for postponing local elections and Environment Canterbury. It's not especially encouraging to give this power to the Minister. And, Mr. Speaker, it is our submission that that power should be exercised not by the Minister of Local Government, but by the electoral officer, who is the proper person to make that judgment and to suspend the election. And if we have to give extra powers, it should be to the electoral officer and not to the Minister. And again, we intend to move SOPs to that effect when the time comes. There are other provisions we support in this bill, which we've heard a little bit about from the government members. Greater information about candidates available, including whether they live within the boundaries, although a useful clarification from the Select Committee is to point out they don't have to disclose their address in order to disclose that. The exclusion of goods and services with a value of $300 or less, again a sensible amendment by the Select Committee. And broadly speaking, Mr. Speaker, we support the provisions of this bill. But to sum up, the basic change made by this bill is an improvement on the status quo, and we support it, but it could have done so much more, perhaps most importantly, to regulate third-party spending in local body elections, and it's a missed opportunity to achieve what the Minister himself has said was the aim of this legislation, to bring it into line with the provisions for local government elections, for general elections. It's a great shame that it does not do that, Mr Speaker, but we do support the bill.
I call the honourable member Alfred Nairo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Kia ora.